What's up, guys? I hope you had a great weekend. It was a pretty chilled weekend for me. No motorsport at all. It was just family stuff. It was just nice weekend. So I hope it was for you guys too. Thanks again for all the questions, because today is Monday, which means it's time for hashtag Ask Elvis, and that means it's time to roll the sting. Loads of great questions as always. Thank you very much again. I'm going to start with this one from Campbell Hicks, and this is a question that lots of people have asked me over time. I see it pop up loads of times on motorsport forums. I see it everywhere. The question is, what are the reasons they don't bring back ground effects? Clearly you can follow closely, and he's popped a link in there to an old sports car race from the 70s. Now, the reason I'm slightly chuckling is because First of all, look, ground effect. Let's quickly explain, because this is an often much confused topic. Ground effect, we all experience ground effect in modern Formula One cars. Ground effect is the effect of the aerodynamics, the airflow rushing over a moving Formula One car and coming into contact with the stationary ground, the stationary floor of the racetrack, and the impact that that stationary floor has with the boundary layer running along the underside of the car. When the airflow comes into contact with the stationary ground, it has an effect where it slows down part of that airflow. That's ground effect, right? So we have that appears everywhere, affects everything. And we can utilise ground effect to our advantage if we're able to seal off the sides. And that's, I guess, what you're referring to, Campbell, is sealing off, like we had back in the 70s. We had it on Formula One cars, we had it on sports cars. You seal with side skirts the underside of the floor to create a channel, if you like, a sealed channel under the car. And that's how you maximise the airflow, maximise the effect of the diffuser, sucking the car down to the floor. What you're referring to, and what lots of people refer to, is that the fact that they all say, if we utilise ground effect to our advantage, to use that to give the predominant downforce generating area of the car, if that sucks the car onto the floor and we then less rely on the over-the-top surfaces, the wings, is that not going to benefit the racing? Does it create less turbulent wake behind? The reality is, and we all have to bear this in mind, the people looking at the Formula One regs, the current commission who are looking at this now for Liberty have conducted extensive research. They've got a vast array of tools and very complex simulation systems to be able to test out these things in the virtual world, and their findings are that actually no, that doesn't necessarily on its own help the racing. It doesn't necessarily create less of a wake. It creates a different wake behind the lead car. So they've put a lot of things into place now, looking particularly towards 2021, that they think, and so far their simulations show, will create a better ability to follow closely with the car in front, and therefore the opportunity to overtake. And that doesn't just involve utilising the ground effect phenomenon. It's about all sorts of things, like the minimum complexity of the wings, like the reduced outwash effect that we're going to see to some extent in 2019. So there are so many other things at play here. It's not as simple as just putting ground effect side skirts onto the car and making the underside of the car the predominant downforce generating area. That's not just the answer. I know it seems like it. I know if you look back at old footage, and the link that Campbell put in his question there, I watched it. Yeah, it's great racing. But that's a snapshot in time from back in the 70s. There are plenty of other races in the 70s that were dull, that weren't great. Same with the 80s, same with the 90s. There's a mix of great races and very dull races. And that is what we have now. We still have some great races in modern Formula One, but we have some dull ones. And the mentality of the watching public, the huge fan base of Formula One, the general mentality, and this doesn't apply to everybody, of course, but the general mentality, it's almost this siege mentality. We all love to complain about stuff. We all love to seize on something and say, look, this isn't as good as it used to be. Let's go back to what we had before. Well, that doesn't work anymore. The technology's moved on. The overall shape of the cars has moved on. Some of the circuits have moved on. The driving styles have moved on. The ability of teams to predict what will happen through simulation, the ability of teams to maximise every single bit of airflow around the whole car, it's all changed. So we're in a completely different landscape to the one that we were at in the 70s. So it's not as simple, unfortunately, as bolting some 1970s aerodynamic skirts on the side of a car and hoping that's going to fix everything. Ron Knox says, Mark, what are your thoughts on apprentice engineers also collaborating with eSports drivers or engineering their own setups as a leg up to F1, FE or other types of pro series? Keeping in mind, for example, Nicky Thiem, who it's a big pro sim racer and eSport racer. Check out his channel. Well, I have checked out his channel. It's great. He's a sort of real world racer that has evolved into sim racing and is very, very good at it. Along with others, he competes in the iRacing Championship. What are my thoughts on the engineering side? In platforms like iRacing, where the engineering model is very good, there's nothing wrong with utilising young apprentice engineers. I think it's actually a great platform to be able to learn on. Even at Formula One teams, the young apprentice engineers often start in the sim at the Formula One team, because it's a huge area of Formula One, and changing components on the sim, in the sim world, has this, you see out you play out the effects on the real car. You see the effect of a change, and that's all part of this learning process for engineers. So absolutely, I think esports and sim racing has a huge part to play, not only as a driver, but actually you're going to start seeing teams coming into this from an engineering point of view as well, and I think that's a great thing. Particularly, by the way, when real-world testing in Formula One and lots of other championships is first of all limited by the regs in F1, but also very expensive to do in the lower categories, where to go on a day's testing can be a huge chunk of your budget for the season. So it's a great idea. Stuart Grindlay says, Mark, what was the relationship like with the test team and the designers at McLaren? Could you come up with ideas that would then be used on the car? And this is referring to the video I did on Friday. We just had a lot of love from you guys with my mate Vince, who was sat here when we worked together on the test team. If you haven't seen that video, I'll link it at the end. It's worth checking out. It made us laugh a lot making it. And I will be doing more of those with some ex-colleagues further down the line. So thanks for the love for that. We were on the test team together, Vince and I, and your question, Stuart, talks about the relationship between the mechanics, the test team and the designers. Absolutely, the test team was a key part of that process of feeding back information to the drawing office, to the designers, to help shape the future development of parts. Or if we had an idea, we absolutely could go and talk to the designers, and some ideas definitely came directly from the test track, where we had this ability to run constantly round and round and round, try things out, which we don't necessarily have at the racetrack on a race weekend. So it was a real key area of every Formula One team, and I'm sure lots of the innovations, lots of the ideas, not just for setup and setup tweaks, but for actual design components, all had their origins with mechanics and engineers at the on the test team at each Formula One team. So yeah, huge part of the process as it was back then. Rainer Werner Mindbinder, I hope I got that name right, says, I was just watching an old non-championship F1 race from Brands Hatch in 1979. Lauda, Piquet, Villeneuve, Andretti. Really epic stuff. Anyway, with the ballooning schedule in F1, would it be even considered to make some of these races non-championship races? Maybe in these races, teams could field young drivers or test drivers to spice up the variety of action. In terms of creating a specific race for younger drivers, and if we force the teams to do it, so if we take one of the 21 races, for example, and say, right, you're still got to do 21 races, but one of those will be a non-championship event, I don't see any reason why we couldn't make that for young drivers, young test drivers, or rookies. I think it's actually a really nice idea. It's something that breaks from tradition, but I'm all for that. So yeah, I think it's something that absolutely could be considered, as long as we sort of mandate that the teams have to sign up to it and have to take part in it. Right, this is the question that's cropped up a lot, and this one from Jonathan Moore. He says, with so many F1 teams based in England, what effect could Brexit have on the F1 world? Will every F1 driver wind up living in Monaco or Switzerland? With only one race in the UK, wouldn't it make more sense to be based in Europe? Right, well, this has cropped up loads over the last few months, understandably, and even more so in the last few weeks. And the reality is that, look, we have got a lot of the Formula One teams, by far most of the Formula One teams based here in the UK, and the problems that they potentially face will come when there becomes difficulty or confusion about moving personnel and equipment and parts and all the things that a Formula One team needs between all of the countries, between all the European countries, and also buying in parts, materials we source from other countries, staff, personnel we bring in from other countries, because Formula One needs the best in every single area. So sometimes they're not coming from the UK, sometimes we're bringing people in from Europe or further afield. And the problems are going to come when that becomes much more difficult to do. Is it going to become much more time consuming, much more expensive to start moving things around? Is the visa application process going to become hugely complicated? Is it going to be difficult to go from one European country into another European country when you're not from the EU, which most teams are not? So there are so many potential complications, and the biggest problem, like with everything with Brexit, and I really don't want to get into a political argument here, but the problem is that there's confusion. Nobody knows what will happen, and that is what all of the Formula One teams need to know, like everybody does. What's going to happen? Which direction are we going to go? Because Formula One teams, I guess like most big businesses, they need to prepare, and we in Formula One like to do everything meticulously. We like to have everything prepared to the most almost forensic level. And at the moment, nobody can do that because nobody knows. Darlow79, good question, says, "Hi Mr. Elvis, if you could go back in time, what team and driver would you have loved to work with?" So I think for me, and obviously there's the likes of Senna. I would have loved to have worked with Senna. James Hunt would have been a lot of fun. Working at Hesketh with James Hunt must have been amazing, I'm sure, just for the laughs. But I think professionally I would have loved to have worked at Ferrari during that era where Ross Brawn and Jean Todt and Rory Byrne and those kind of people were running the show and Michael Schumacher was driving. I would have loved to have just been part of that process, that hugely successful process. And I'd love to have worked with Michael. I obviously hear and see great things, but at the time he was our biggest rival when I was racing with Mika and with Kimi. So I'd have loved to have seen that from the other side of the fence, perhaps. Stephen Chan says, after watching Grand Prix Driver, and that's the McLaren show that was on Amazon Prime, if you remember, about this time last year, he says, I wonder if the way how the launch went of the MCL32 until Barcelona, he says, is that normal in F1? It looked so chaotic, it surprised me a bit. Right, well, it is quite normal. These are the launch of a new car is a hugely stressful time. It's the culmination of nearly a year's worth of work where you have this launch date. So right back in, I don't know, kind of March, April time, there would have been a launch date for the new car of the following year, and everything then works back from that. All of the long lead time manufacturing components like the chassis, the gearbox casings, all of these things, the design process, the testing, the manufacturing, everything funnels towards this launch date. And when you've got lead times of 6 months on some components, that can be quite stressful when it comes down to the sharp end. And what you saw in that Grand Prix Driver documentary was a pretty chaotic McLaren. And if I'm honest, when I watched that show, I was a little bit surprised that McLaren allowed that level of access, because it was I'm pleased they did, because it was chaotic. It was also quite stressful. It was a very difficult time because obviously things didn't work out as they hoped it would either, with the Honda relationship breaking down. So there's lots of honesty in that show, but the reality is that it can often be like that, just because that's an immovable date. Often it's the beginning of the first test. It's an immovable date. So sometimes in the weeks and the days leading up to that launch date, it's all hands on deck. It can be working all night, and if you have a problem which can't be predicted, you've just got to get through it. But that's F1, that's how it works. So yeah, we always say it's a bit like the analogy of a swan on the water, isn't it? The swan looking all calm and serene on top, but underneath the legs are going like crazy to send it off down the river. And that's quite often how a Formula One team operates. Helga Kuistra says, do space engineers and F1 engineers share their knowledge with each other? Both work at the maximum of material and technology capabilities, only space tech has more reliability built in. They kind of do, not on a formal basis, but there have been crossovers in the past, and there are lots of materials that have first been used in space exploration that have found their way into F1, but actually it's also gone the other way. There were some exhaust heat shielding materials that we used in Formula One that actually found their way onto rockets that went up to space. And I remember McLaren even designing some electrical components that went up into a satellite into space through their McLaren Electronic Systems branch of the organisation way back when I was there in sort of 2008, 2009. So absolutely it does happen. And I suspect that with all the research and development that goes into both areas, both industries will monitor or will keep some eye on what the other's doing for a breakthrough in materials science or those kind of things. So yeah, absolutely there's crossover, even if it's not on a sort of formal basis. McLaren Applied Technologies, who are now branching out into all sorts of other industries, and Williams as well, are starting to look into those kind of areas where they can push the boundaries even further, because it all kind of helps. The R&D that will go into those projects could filter back to Formula One and vice versa. Mark Saunders says, can you say a few words on tyres? I'd like to know how they're made and what differs between them and the tyres used on road cars. Okay, well, apart from the obvious ones, that one has a tread on it, one slick, they are made very differently. They're designed very differently. Your road car, of course, is designed with durability in mind. It's got to last for, I don't know, 10,000 kilometres or whatever it's got to last. Probably more than that even. You don't want to be changing them every 5 minutes, but a race car is only designed to last for a stint of a Grand Prix. And so with that in mind, your road car tyre is heavy. It's constructed from a steel belted, it's a radial tyre with lots of steel belts running around it. The compound of the rubber itself is hard. It's not necessarily temperature dependent in terms of generating the grip. It's designed to shift a load of water through those carefully designed channels. All designed to be safe and to perform at a constant level for a long period of time. Your race car is designed Your race car is designed to, first of all, only last for that short period of time, but during that short period of time deliver huge amounts of grip. And to do that, it has to be switched on in terms of temperature. It has to be raised to a certain temperature where the chemical compound starts to soften, and it really does soften, and generate the grip when it comes into contact with the tarmac. It's manufactured from different materials, lighter weight materials, nylon and polyester, or through this really complex and specifically designed weave in terms of the construction. The compound, the rubber, is a chemical compound. It's a synthetic rubber, and it's designed, as I said, to switch on at certain temperatures, deliver a huge amount of grip. It's very, very soft, but wears out very, very quickly. So that's basically the difference. They're designed for purpose, and the purpose of the two are hugely different. I will try and do a separate video explaining in more depth about Formula One tyres, because I think there's some interesting content to be done there. Right, last question, and this one comes from Andre F. He says, how far are we from Formula E running on a closed circuit? Even a short one, such as the Red Bull Ring. Is that even in the plans? It would be interesting. Right, Andre and everybody else who constantly says to me, I'm not watching Formula E until they get onto proper circuits like Spa and Monza. And I want them to sound loud, I want them to sound noisy, I want them to be fast as Formula One. Look, those people who want that, you've got Formula One. It already exists. Watch Formula One. If you don't like Formula E, that's absolutely fine. The point behind Formula E, and to specifically answer your question, Andre, Formula E was set up with a couple of things in mind. First of all, to start, to improve the idea of R&D into this electric drivetrain technology. And that's why all the manufacturers are piling in at the rate they are, because there's a definite transfer. The learning and the understanding and the tech that's being developed in Formula E can directly transfer into these companies' road cars. The other was to bring the racing to the people in city centres where electric cars are needed most. So it's promoting the use of electric cars in a city centre. They decided to not force people to come out of town and travel hundreds of miles to a dedicated venue like we do in Formula One. And it's fine, it works in Formula One, but Formula E has this completely different concept. Personally, I love it. I think it's a great concept. And I know that sometimes the circuits, because of the layout of the city streets sort of layout as it is, you're limited to some extent in what circuit you can produce. But you know what? It does not ruin the racing. And those people who criticise Formula E without watching it, I say watch a race, because the racing is always fantastic. So, Andre, the idea that we end up racing a proper closed circuit, a more traditional circuit, I don't think is in the plans for Formula E at the moment. Maybe way down the line when you know, if we talk about Formula E becoming a kind of rival for Formula 1 at some point, or Formula 1 going fully electric, or the two merging, whatever, that's a long way off. But if that were to ever happen, maybe that could be something to be considered. But at the moment, Formula E is all about city centre street racing, in city centres where the people are, and it's about racing on the roads, and that is what it's about. I actually really like it. So I don't think there's any plans at the moment to go racing on a more traditional racetrack. Right, thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate all of the questions, as I say, as ever. So please do keep them coming. Loads more to do this week. Going to try and get a video out every day, I think, this week. Should be possible. So please let me know. Let me know if there's anything specific you want to see or me to explain. But keep the questions coming. Have a great week, guys. Thanks for all the love, and I will see you soon.